Good evening, and welcome to Global Minnesota's first digital global conversation, a look at Italy today with Professor of Journalism and author Alexander Stille. I'm Tim Odegaard, Program Director at Global Minnesota. I'm pleased now to introduce our speaker for this evening's program, Alexander Stille, Sao Paulo Professor of International Journalism at Columbia University. Professor Stille graduated with a BA from Yale University, earned a Master of Science at Columbia. His journalistic career includes contributions to the New York Times, La Repubblica, the New Yorker Magazine, the New York Review of Books, the Atlantic Monthly, New Republic, Correspondent, U.S. News and World Report, the Boston Globe, and the Toronto Globe and Mail. He's also a prolific and celebrated author of books on Italy, and his awards include the Los Angeles Times Book Award for Best Work of History, the Premio Acqui, San Francisco Chronicle Critics' Choice Award, and the Elisa Patterson Foundation Award for Journalism. I will now turn the screen over to our distinguished speaker, Professor Alexander Stille. Thank you, Professor Stille.
Hi. Thanks, Tim, for that kind introduction, and thank all of you for participating. I realize that I'm competing with Hulu and Netflix, but hopefully you will have gone through enough of your wish list to take time for this talk. Normally, when one talks about Italy, it's almost necessary to explain why Italy, but in the middle of this tragic pandemic, which has rocketed around the world, it's a little less necessary to do that since, as we all know, the pandemic moved rapidly from China. Italy then became the hotspot, only to be replaced by the US as the locus of the epidemic now. So we look at Italy for lessons to what might be ahead in a few weeks for us. I just sort of put on the screen some of the images from Italy in these days. That's the Duomo of Milan, which has been at the epicenter of the epidemic. And there's St. Mark's Square. Since none of us are going to be able to travel to Italy in the next month or two, I thought I'd give you a little taste of what we're all missing. I actually was supposed to be in Italy in the middle of March, and needless to say, didn't make that trip. There's a Colosseum with no foot traffic, the Trevi Fountain, the capital of Rome, and St. Peter's Square, that's Via della Conciliazione. So I think it's been clear for all of us in the last 2 months as we've tried to understand the meaning of the coronavirus crisis is it's kind of revealed the fault lines, weaknesses, and strengths in some cases of the different societies that it's hit. And in Italy, the virus has a particular geography. You can see here from this slide, the big red circle around Milan and Lombardy. And you see that in the numbers over here, that Lombardy accounts for practically half of the cases in Italy and 3 times as large as any other. You might say, well, why Lombardy? The reasons are actually, ironically, part of Lombardy's good fortune. This is a map of the distribution of wealth in Italy. Lombardy is an exceptionally prosperous, industrious region. It is arguably, along with regions surrounding it, the kind of economic motor of the country. And as a result, of course, it's very connected to the rest of the world by business and commerce. And the towns that were the first sort of hotspots of the pandemic occurred in these towns north of Milan that are very important in the area of textile and clothing manufacture, companies that regularly do business with China, and therefore we're going to be among the first places to get the COVID-19 virus. This is a little graphic of the distribution of foreign direct investment in Italy, and you see that the south of Italy toward the bottom receives almost no foreign direct investment. The north and the center of the country overwhelmingly the lion's share. So that partly explains the map we saw with the geographic distribution. Another thing that this crisis has made sort of tragically evident is the high mortality rate. Italy has had, along with Belgium, the sad distinction of one of the highest mortality rates in the world. And the reason for that is, in a sense, simple. Italy is one of the oldest countries. You could say that in some ways it's the price of success. Italians live a long time, and they've been producing small numbers of children. And as a result, the population is aging rapidly. And as you can see in this graphic here, over 22% of the population is over 64, and well over half of the population, 59%, is over 40. So that makes, particularly in the over 64 category, people vulnerable to the more severe consequences of the pandemic. Another factor in this, and one that becomes sort of important to the political story that I plan on telling, is Lombardy is also the region with the highest percentage of immigrants. Why that's important, I'll get into a little bit later. But obviously, one of the challenges in trying to get control of a virus like this is knowing who has it. And if you have large numbers of undocumented people, that becomes difficult and problematic. And the politics of that are sort of important in terms of the story that I'll be telling. You can see as well that this division between North and South and the importance of Lombardy and the area in the North has real political consequences. The part of the map I'm showing you that's blue represents the recent very considerable gains of a party called the Lega, the Northern, originally it was the Northern League, it's now simply the League, which is began as an autonomous party of regional autonomy for the north of Italy, but has become increasingly a nationalist party. And they won very big. They've always done very well in the north of Italy and have expanded their popularity in other parts of the country. The red sections in the middle are sort of known as Italy's red belt, which has traditionally been a left-wing region, and the yellow part in the south is dominated politically by a movement called the Five Star Movement, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Italy has been doing, after an initial slow response to the crisis, managed to do relatively well in flattening the curve. You can see the top red line are the number of total cases, and which has been sort of gradually going down. The black line at the bottom is the the number of deaths, which has been essentially flattened and is beginning to go down. And there you can see it in relation to the US. Italy, in order to do this, has taken even more stringent measures than have been taken in the US. Friends of mine I've been in communication with haven't left their house in some case for a couple of weeks. You can be given a ticket if you walk more than a couple hundred yards from your house. Parks are closed. So a lot of things we think we have it bad in terms of sheltering in place, but they've done a very, very stringent job. And hence you can see some amusing scenes like this wild boar that is happy to realize that he now has the run of whatever town this picture was taken in. The political beneficiary of this relatively successful, and I should say relatively, is a man named Giuseppe Conte, who was prime minister, was prime minister before this happened, as prime minister during this crisis. And it's interesting because Italians in general don't love their political leaders. That's not unique to Italy, but the Italians are particularly that way. And it's interesting to see. I looked up the polling numbers for the different recent governments, and these are the approval ratings of the people who've been governing Italy over the last 4 or 5 years. And they've mostly been in the underwater category of approval ratings, under 50. Then Conte enjoyed a brief popularity when he took over with the center-right government, going up to 62. Then before this crisis was down to 40. And then you see him going all the way up to 71, which for Italy is exceptionally high. So that there has been a kind of rallying around the flag, a surprising degree of discipline and respect for the sheltering in place rules that the government has imposed. And so far, this has sort of had the effect of, in effect, suspending the normal dynamic of political life. Interestingly, now that the most sort of drastic moment of crisis seems to be abating, and Italy is beginning to debate reopening in some way. They've now planned what's called a phase 2, which would involve the reopening of some non-essential businesses on May 4th. The usual political dynamics of Italy are now reasserting themselves. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. To understand how that might play out and what might be ahead, it's necessary to go back a little bit. Italy, like many countries around the world, including our own, but maybe for a slightly longer time, have been dealing with a kind of growing populism, a growing discontent with politics as usual, discontent with the central government in Rome. And the first big manifestation of this political change began in northern Italy, precisely in the Lombardy region that we were talking about earlier, with a party that initially seemed to be kind of a joke called the Lega Lombarda, which was its first name, founded by this gentleman in the picture here, Umberto Bossi, who was pushing for regional autonomy and eventually secession for the northern regions of Italy, on the grounds that these regions didn't receive their fair share of government taxes and services that they were supporting. The less prosperous regions, in particularly the south, had a very sort of strong anti-Southern rhetoric to it, and anti-Rome rhetoric to it. It had a kind of, initially, it seemed like a sort of folkloric, not terribly serious movement. You'll see the gentleman in the center there with the green hat has on a shirt that says Padania. Padania is a sort of imaginary region that Bossi invented, which would represent the regions that are fed by the River Po, and so Padania is derived from the adjective for Po, which is Padano in Italian. He brought a kind of sort of FU populism to Italian politics, as you can see from his gesture here, which is sort of typical of his. He had kind of a rabble rouser, stirring up the crowd kind of approach to politics, which worked well, but it didn't travel very well outside of the regions of northern Italy because it was mainly addressed to the discontents of people in the north and directed against. So this says first the north. That was their part of their initial appeal. And it was directed against Rome. So here's one of their most famous posters, which I've translated as Rome, the big thief, the League never forgets. And you see here, the symbol is a knight, which represents something called the refers to a medieval alliance of northern cities that existed in the 13th century. But you see some of the themes are ones that are actually sort of familiar to our world today. This one says, no to the invasion of Chinese products, so anti-international trade, no more money to Rome, pushing for the northern regions to be able to tax themselves and keep the money rather than sending it to Rome. This is an interesting one that anticipates the sort of anti-immigrant feeling, and with this picture of an Indian chief in the U.S. and says they weren't able to stop immigration and now they live on reservations. Think about it. Here again, another Lega slogan: less taxes to Rome, more money from the families in the north. Their celebrations had a kind of folkloric element in which they were reimagining what they thought Celtic rituals might be in these events that they would hold. In some ways, it's easy to laugh at this, but if you think about something like the Tea Party demonstrations where they were dressing up in 18th century garb, in a way it's similar. Their grievances are very much contemporary, but they were adopting a kind of choreography that harked back to another era. Finally, this movement sort of ran out of gas because the idea of secession was really a losing proposition and had no appeal beyond the regions of northern Italy, and even a limited appeal in northern Italy. So the movement ended up being sort of taken over by this man who brought them into his government. This is Silvio Berlusconi, with his $1 million smile, make that $1 billion smile. As you see, he sort of projected a different kind of populism in which he quite self-consciously styled himself after both Ross Perot, another businessman entering into politics, but also very much after Ronald Reagan. He had a kind of morning in Italy charisma that worked very well. He had earned his money during college singing on cruise ships and brought a kind of feel for media and entertainment. He made his money initially in real estate, and then became the largest owner of private television in Italy, bought himself a magnificent aristocratic villa, and began to project a different kind of populism, which in some ways, here you see him, he bought the Milan soccer team, Milan, and won a series of championships with it, which was a big part of his growing national popularity. And in many ways, he put together a formula which should be quite familiar to Americans who watched the rise of Donald Trump. He combined real estate fortune, a large a feel for media, a fluency with the use of television, a kind of macho appeal, bragging about his relationships with women, problems with hair, which I indicate here. A sort of paradoxical ability to be a billionaire who appeals across class lines and has a kind of working class appeal. a curious weakness for Vladimir Putin, which seems to be common, and a mix of anger and calm. He then ended up being sort of felled by a series of personal scandals. You all may recall the Bunga Bunga scandal. This is the woman who set off that scandal, who was an underage woman who attended these parties. This is a woman he placed in a government who was one of the organizers of the party. But the bigger problem, and I think the real reason why Berlusconi's version of populism failed, was that during the nearly 20 years where he was the most powerful person in government and in politics, was that Italy continued to flatline economically. I think one of the most significant things to know and understand about Italy is that in the early 90s, Berlusconi entered politics in 1993. Italy was equal to, if not slightly above, the United Kingdom in terms of its GDP. It's now more than 20% less than Great Britain. And so that is the result of steady erosion. Here are the different countries of Europe compared in terms of GDP, and Italy is right down there with Greece. And so that, I think, really spelled Berlusconi's doom. I think they would have put up with his personal shenanigans had he brought the prosperity that he promised. This then paved the way for a kind of intermediary figure, Matteo Renzi, who staged a kind of coup of the main center-left party, which had also governed in alternation with Berlusconi during the 90s and 2000s. This phrase that he has at the back, he sort of came in as the sort of demolition man. Rotomare means to send something to the junk heap. And so Renzi promised to send the old political class to the junk heap, and was only partially successful in that. Unfortunately, it was very difficult for him to get reforms that he wanted through Parliament. You see his sort of appeal to a younger generation. Renzi was one of the youngest people ever to be prime minister of Italy, and also cultivating a kind of celebrity appeal. People were very enthusiastic about the promises of reform that Renzi offered, and he brought his party up to 41% in European elections in 2014, which in Italy's proportional system is an extraordinarily high share. Unfortunately, the economic growth that he promised didn't quite materialize. There was a little bit of improvement, but Italy was still, even in a good year, moving at about 1% annual growth after many years of stagnation. Output per worker in Italy has sort of continued to go down, and so that Renzi understood that Italy needed deep structural reform, but wasn't able to create the political consensus necessary to make that happen. This kind of increasing stagnation and a sense of frustration with politics as usual paved the way for Populism 4.0, a man named Beppe Grillo, who is a comedian by profession, who always had a sort of political bite to his satire and managed to translate his satire into a political movement, which was quite extraordinary. One of the things that's interesting, that's Grillo at one of his performances, he was actually banned from Italian TV at one point for making fun of the Socialist Party, which was then in the government. And then he ended up building up this extraordinary career where he would fill these large auditoria with people. And eventually, um, because his performances were always very political, um, this man here to the right with the glasses saw, who was a web guru, um, realized that Grillo's performances could easily translate into a political movement, and this guy John Roberto Casaleño created a website for Beppe Grillo, which turned into um, one of the most popular blogs in the world. And for a blog in Italian to be one of the most popular websites in the world is quite extraordinary. And they managed in a remarkably short time to turn this into a major political movement. What is sort of interesting, if you look at the different iterations of populism in Italy, Berlusconi was a master of television and used television and money to create a political movement almost out of nothing. And Grillo represents populism in the early 2000s of using a website and interactive technology and crowdsourcing to develop a political movement in the 2000s. This then becomes a very powerful channel for public anger, which is growing in this period of stagnation. You see him before a crowd. One of his most famous political acts, as he's beginning to form his political movement, he decides that he's going to organize a day throughout Italy called V-Day for Vaffanculo, and I've translated that to the left, which means what you think it does. And he managed to get 3 million people to gather in squares all around Italy in order to yell Vaffanculo to the political class of Italy all at the same time. And that kind of, organizing through the web and combining spectacle and entertainment with politics ended up being remarkably successful we're now in the 2010s. There's him doing his Vafa gesture. Something that started to become a factor in Italian politics, particularly around 2015, 2016, was the rapid increase of illegal immigration. Here you see boatloads of people in very precarious vessels heading toward Italian shores. And you see the rather extraordinary climb of people arriving illegally in Italy by boat. The height of it is in 2016, which you see at the top of that, where 160 people arrive in 1 year. Here you see the month-by-month totals. One of the things that I think is very symbolically important in understanding the rise of, here I'm going to go, this is Salvini, who starts to create a very sort of loud and active anti-immigrant politics. This is not, is that in that year of 2016, 161 people arrived by boat on Italian shores, but something like 140,000 younger Italians leave the country in search of their fortunes elsewhere. So you have these two processes happening at the same time, where many younger Italians feel there are no jobs and there's no future for them in Italy, and they're leaving on planes, and desperate people from North Africa and Africa are reaching Italy by boat. So the sense for a lot of ordinary Italians, even though these things are not strictly related, is that things are going in the wrong direction. We're losing control of our country. We're losing control of our borders, and there's no future for our children. So you see then a very rapid political change where as I mentioned, Renzi and his Democratic Party did exceptionally well in 2014, and that's the orange line on the left, gaining 41% in these European elections. The Lega and the Five Star together only managed a little under 20% in that same election. Just 4 years later, you see a remarkable reversal of fortune, where the combined total of the Lega and the Five Star movement are now in a position in national elections to govern. Salvini took his party from near dead after Bossi's collapse into being, in a quite short time, the largest single party in Italy. You'll notice here a slogan that should be familiar to many Americans, and in fact was quite consciously echoing Trump's appeal to American nationalism. There were lots of pictures early on in his career. Salvini was very much in the Bossi camp of Northern separatism. You see him wearing, as a young man, the T-shirt "Padania is not Italy," and there he is with Bossi. But then you see him now wearing, it sort of was unthinkable for the Lega of Bossi to be wearing a Rome soccer jersey, let alone a Sicilian sweatshirt. Salvini successfully, with a kind of new nationalist appeal, broadened the Lega's electoral consensus and won a surprising number of votes throughout the country. He also did it by appealing to frustration with the European Union and to Euro sentiment. Italy has not done well, for whatever reason, since joining the European Union. And here he is with Marine Le Pen of the Front National in France. He was an early backer of Trump well before, interestingly, Berlusconi did not back Trump. He backed Hillary Clinton. Salvini instead backed Trump, and it worked for him. You also find, again, the strange attraction between certain parties and Putin. There's Salvini and Putin. Salvini then did so well in the polls. He formed a government together with the Five Star movement after the 2018 election. The Five Star was the larger at that point of the two parties, but Salvini very shrewdly assumed the position of Minister of the Interior and stopped all boats coming into the country. And that led to an enormous rise in the Lega's popularity. He was leading in all of the polls, and he decided, somewhat incautiously, to bring his own government down, thinking that it would lead to new elections, and then he would be able to re-enter the government as prime minister in a position of superiority vis-a-vis the Five Star movement. Instead, the Five Star movement, there you see the stopping of the illegal crossings in the EU. The Five Star movement represents the yellow color in the middle, actually had a larger share of votes in parliament than did the Lega, and aligned with the red people over here, which is the PD, to form this government that with Conte. Now that when this new configuration of the Five Star movement joining with the PD, in some ways was a kind of move of desperation, because particularly the Five Star movement had really collapsed in the polls and was afraid if they went to elections, they would lose very badly to the Lega. So they allied themselves with the Democratic Party and were struggling along in a somewhat unhappy marriage when the pandemic happened. The pandemic then has, to some degree, reshuffled the political deck. The bar on your right, which is in the lighter blue, represents polling numbers that were just taken the other day. These are not votes. The other bars you see are actual vote totals from different years in which elections were held. But you see that at least the short-term effect of the coronavirus crisis has been to slightly reduce the standing of the Lega, slightly improve the standing of the PD, and leave the five-star movement in a sort of holding pattern. Where I'm going to conclude, and I'm now toward the end of the talk, is that I think what is happening and will happen, for better or worse, and possibly for worse, now that the crisis, it's too early to say that the crisis is ending, but Italy is planning on reopening at least some of its businesses in May, is that we're going to see the problems that existed in Italy before this crisis reemerge, and to some degree, they may emerge in much more critical condition. The latest, I was looking at the Italian papers this morning, the latest estimate is that Italy's GDP may drop by 15% just because of this crisis. That, of course, is massive. And in the graphic you have here, you see the regional nature of its unemployment problem and its economic problem, with unemployment in the South being 20%, and this is before the crisis, under just about 5% in the North. Already there are indications from initial news reports that this crisis has been very hard on southern Italy, where people, shopkeepers and lots of other people have been doing essentially without income the last couple months. The other thing that is not going away, even though illegal immigration has ground to a halt and there are not these boatloads of people, Italy is faced with a really huge demographic crisis, which is not going away. I just checked the website of Italy's sort of statistics bureau, and you see that 636,000 Italians died last year, and fewer than 450 were born. The population as a whole went down by 235,000, and that's even including the more than 500,000 Italians that gained citizenship during the year. So Italy has a serious demographic problem. It produces, the average Italian woman has 1.3 children, which is obviously way short of replacement rate. So that many of the political problems, Salvini has staked a lot of his political career on ending foreign immigration. But as you saw from the map of Lombardy, there is a huge demand for foreign labor in the most productive northern parts of the country. Italy can never afford its generous pension system without the presence of foreign labor. And so there are all sorts of really deep, unresolved problems in Italy that unfortunately are only going to be aggravated by the current crisis. Italy, before this all happened, had a public debt of 130% of GDP. I don't think anybody's even calculated what the public debt is going to be when all of the aid that was needed to help people get through this crisis is added up. But I think Italy is facing, after a kind of, sort of sunny rally around the flag moment, is then going to have a very, very tough reawakening as the economy comes back to life. So that's the end of my portion of things. And Tim, I think you were going to go through the questions, and we were going to hear from people in the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. What a great just survey of kind of where things have come through this whole, the different stages of the populist movement. Really appreciate that kind of framing of that. We do have some questions coming in already. And again, I'll remind our attendees, please take a look through the chat function, which you should find most of you at the bottom of your screen, and send any questions in that you might have. First question, just referring to your last comments here about the GDP decline. Question being, doesn't the GDP decline favor La Liga from a political standpoint?
Yes, it will. I mean, I think there's no question. I think that this kind of bounce that Conte enjoyed during the crisis is not likely to last. I mean, my sense is that you can't really paper over deep underlying problems that the country is facing. So I think you're right, or the questioner is right, that the Lega will very soon return as a huge force. I think that this kind of political shuffling that happened when he brought down the government was only going to be a temporary situation. The bringing together of the center-left Democratic Party with the Five Star Movement, which has a very sort of fuzzy, unclear ideology. It's a party that, to put it in American terms, is a little bit like, its supporters would be a little bit like joining together some of Bernie Sanders supporters with some Trump supporters in a rather uneasy mix. And there's the lack of clarity of that party was part of what helped Salvini move to the fore, because Salvini was extremely clear about what he wanted and was very able in pursuing his agenda. So I think that the current coalition is very fragile. The problems that facing the country are huge. Eventually, as we know, the party in power ends up paying the price for the situation of the country. And I think that the economic problems are going to make a return of the Lega very, very possible.
Great. So we've got a number of questions of people who are interested in the PowerPoint. So we will be posting the PowerPoint and also a taped version of this program to our website, so you can share with those who might enjoy this as well. Question about some of the industries that are attracting immigrants in the northern part of Italy. Aside from textiles, what are some of those industries?
Well, you know, they do a lot of things. They make furniture, they make machine parts. Italy, for example, there's a big auto industry. They make a lot of the ancillary things to the auto industry. They actually have a big, in central Italy, they have a lot of factories that actually make tool making machines. It's a very sophisticated, I mean, one thing that's important to grasp about Italy is that the center north of Italy is an enormously prosperous, enormously productive part of the world. If you were to separate the north of Italy from the rest of the country, you would have an area with a standard of living that's comparable to Germany, Switzerland, Holland, somewhere like that. And they have businesses that would support that kind of standard of living. And so the immigrants work wherever they're needed. They work in a lot of factories. They're very present in construction. Then increasingly, not just in the north, but you find them increasingly in, like, for example, almost all the fruit stands and vegetable stands around the country are now run by North Africans. These are shops that will stay open for much longer hours than standard Italian shops will do. So if you want to get a bottle of milk or juice at 11 o'clock at night, that's who you're likely to find open, things like that.
You mentioned the large number of immigrants becoming Italian citizens, and there are some question from some about how difficult is it for a person of non-Italian descent to become an Italian citizen?
It's actually extremely difficult, and that's one of the many open political questions for Italy. For example, the Democratic Party was pushing a naturalization bill, which would allow, for example, people who are even people who are born in Italy and have done all of their schooling in Italy. They may be 18 years old and have never lived anywhere but Italy. If their parents are not citizens, they are not citizens, and they do not qualify for citizenship. So the Democratic Party was pushing for a law known as ius soli, which is that essentially, as in this country, if you're born on this soil, you become an American citizen. So they were saying if somebody had been born in this country and done their schooling in the country and not gotten in trouble with the law, they should become citizen. Interestingly, the Five Star Movement has kind of equivocated on the issue of immigration, and they weren't prepared to back that law. So that's one of the many fissures that exist between the two parties that are precariously running the government at the moment. But
And
it's hard to get citizenship.
and for those immigrants who do become citizens, is integration a problem for them? Are they grouped up in ethnic or national enclaves? Are they learning Italian?
I think integration is a problem. Italians are not used to, and I think this is a European-wide problem. The demographic numbers that I showed you on Italy are particularly acute, but they're not dissimilar from numbers in Spain, Germany. France is a little bit of an exception, but basically, Europe as a whole is, if it didn't have immigration, would lose like 40 million people over the next however many years. And so if it wants to maintain its labor force at current levels and people paying into its pension system, they're going to have to accept people coming in from outside. They don't have the same history with immigration that we have, and it's very culturally difficult for them. The Italians have been used to being a culturally homogeneous society, and they're not used to people that don't look like them, don't start out speaking their language. At the same time, Italians are pretty open and welcoming people in general, but I think they have a hard time. So sometimes you'll walk into a smaller Italian town, you walk into a bar, and you'll hear the guy running the bar complaining bitterly about the immigrants, and then some immigrant will walk into the bar and he'll greet him, "Oh, Mustafa, how are you?" And you realize there's no connection between, for this person, that's a person that he knows, that he likes, and with whom he's on friendly terms. And that can coexist with a general hostility to the phenomenon of immigration as a whole. I think the thing that is hard for Italians is that they're used to immigrants occupying marginal positions of service in their society, filling in the jobs that Italians don't want to do, picking tomatoes in the South, olives, and so on, but not occupying positions of authority. And that, I think, is something that they're having trouble getting used to. What is happening, though, is that as those people have been here for a while, immigration really started in the 1990s. It's really very recent for Italy. There are a lot of children going to school. Those people are very integrated. They all speak Italian. And so I suspect that there will be more integration in the future, because there sort of has to be.
There's some questions about Italy's relationship with Europe, and kind of the Euroscepticism of a lot of the political leaders in Italy right now. Just this week, the EU actually extended what they called their heartfelt apology for their response or lack thereof to the COVID crisis in Italy. Do you think that strengthens the anti-European sentiment? What's the momentum there with regard to the feelings
Well,
about
it's
Europe?
interesting because um, one thing that's been an interesting development, I'm glad you raised this because I didn't actually mention it in my talk, and it's important, is that one of the things that Italy has been pushing for in this crisis is help with what will be the enormous debt that this crisis will leave Italy with. And because Italian debt is already huge, and confidence in Italy's ability to pay it back is sometimes shaky. Um, in moments of crisis, the spread between, let's say, German debt, the interest rate for German debt versus Italian debt starts to grow in moments of crisis, leaving Italy with very, very high interest payments. And so the Italians and some of the weaker countries in the EU have said, what we need to deal with this crisis is a Euro bond, that we need to have debt that is guaranteed by all of the countries of the EU so that Italy or Greece or Spain is not left with impossible debt conditions. Curiously enough, there's a certain amount of resistance, and you can imagine, among some of the Northern European countries, Germany and Holland, but in particular, but they've actually showed more willingness to consider this than at any other time. So this will be an interesting test of Europe because, in a sense, one of the things I think many people feel that Europe failed the crisis of the 2008-2009 financial crisis by failing to coming together and offering relief to Greece at its most critical time, or to Spain. Um, and this is another moment where you sort of have to say, if Europe means anything as a united something, and you're dealing with a crisis of this magnitude, what does it mean? If it doesn't mean some degree of solidarity, some degree of mutual aid to help countries go through this, because there is a very serious risk, and I think many people in Europe realize it, that if anti-European sentiment grows, if someone like Salvini, who is instinctively, temperamentally anti-EU, comes to power and the EU has not done its job in helping out countries like Italy, people may say, well, what do we need Europe for? And then the EU unravels. So I think there is an awareness of that, and I think that has to be factored in as a risk.
So we have a number of people who are concerned about or interested in Italy's rebounding, particularly their tourist industry, and some questions specifically about which of the regions of Italy get the most tourist dollars, and what are your thoughts on when people might be going back to Italy and some of those tourist industries becoming active again?
Well, I think, in terms of the first part of it, the Rome is probably the first destination for tourism in Italy. Florence and Venice are quite fine. In some ways, if you're feeling adventurous, this is probably a very good time. Not immediately, but in a couple of months when the warmer weather kicks in, it'll probably be a very safe time to travel. I think all of us are wondering, I think it's just going to be a fact of life that all of us will now be traveling with masks on, that airlines will be, this could be a comfortable time to travel without those middle seats, that people are going to be paying far more attention to hygienics and to social distancing than we ever did before. And so you may find very favorable conditions. Obviously I wouldn't advise this for people with pre-existing conditions or precarious health, but I think at some point a lot of us will be making calculations like this, and at a certain point you'll have very willing people on the other end in very favorable conditions. So let's hope.
Yep, we'll all be looking forward to that. Question about some other political movements that may exist in Italy. How about youth movement or climate or environmental activists? What's their presence in the Italian political scene?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things I didn't mention it for the sake of brevity. I already exceeded everyone's patience by having 95 slides in my PowerPoint. But one of the interesting political movements that emerged just in the last year was a quite spontaneous political movement called the Sardines. And this was when it looked like Salvini's Lega was going to be triumphing everywhere. There were a series of administrative and local elections in Italy earlier at the end of last year. And it looked like Salvini was going to win in a lot of traditional left-wing strongholds like Bologna. And so this movement kind of came out of nowhere called the Sardines, where they would literally pack central squares where Salvini was going to speak like sardines. So in other words, the opposite of social distancing. They were going to pack, 5,000 people into a town square and all hold a rally. Something like that is obviously history. I mean, I don't know when we'll see that type of, so their particular repertoire of protest was almost uniquely unsuited to a pandemic environment. So whether we will see any sardines or whether they're going to be, but of course people are endlessly creative in coming up with things. So we'll probably have this thing where you'll have sardines that are all, 6 feet apart in squares and doing who knows what. I think one of the things that's what was interesting about the sardine movement is that it filled a void where there hadn't been an effective youth movement. The Five-Star Movement was very big. In a way, as I said, it sort of channeled some of the kind of Bernie Sanders type energy. I mean, unfortunately, Beppe Grillo is a hard figure to hang a whole political party around because he's kind of wacky. I mean, he's not crazy, but he sort of combines a sort of anti-vax loopiness together with a lot of populist anger, together with environmental stuff, all in a kind of strange blend. There isn't really a Green Party. And I think one of the things that has been a real deficiency on the part of the center left is an inability to excite younger people and to bring them into it. And the Sardine movement was an interesting sort of bottom-up type of movement that had a sort of center-left orientation, but that was totally independent of the organized political parties.
Well, Alexander, I think we're coming to the end of our time here. It's been really so so informative, and your insightful analysis and the new information that you've shared are really helpful to us as we look and see what's going on Italy right now and what's going to be happening in the days to come. We have obviously you've got a great deal of affection that goes along with your vast knowledge of Italy. And as we look for the next year, 3 years, 5 years for Italy, what do you expect to see for Italy, and what do you hope? What's your hope for Italy?
My expectations and my hopes are rather far apart, I'm afraid. As I said, I look at the economic picture and the political picture, and I worry a great deal. My hope is one thing that's very encouraging is I'm still enormously impressed that with all the problems that Italy has, it produces exceptional people. The younger people I see, the Italian university system is kind of a mess, but it actually still produces remarkably well-trained and well-educated people. I see them at the university where I teach in New York. I see a lot of Italian students, and they're well-prepared, smart, ambitious, capable. What is discouraging is that they see more possibilities for their future in this country than in Italy, and that saddens me. So my hope is that they can begin creating a better future for younger Italians in Italy, and that they figure out political formula and economic formula that makes that possible.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, Alexander, for this program tonight. And thank you to everyone for joining us on this first foray into digital programming. We look forward to seeing you again next month, May 20th, when we'll be joined by Inter-American Dialogue's Director of Programs for Latin America and China, Margaret Myers, for an exploration of China's relationship with Latin America. Again, thank you, Alexander, and good night, everybody.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody.